So if you don't know me, my name is Zach Peterson. I work in Red Hat Consulting. I am in our automation practice, so I do pretty much nothing but Ansible projects with customers. Um, so kind of a overview of what I wanted to talk about here. Um, there exists Ansible content for managing AWX and Ansible Tower for putting configuration into those systems. And so what you're looking at right now is the awx.awx collection. So in the nomenclature of Ansible collections, you've got your namespace, which is AWX, and you've got your collection name, which is also AWX. So you have awx.awx. Sorry if I say AWS, I do that all the time. Um, so that's what this is. This is on Galaxy. Galaxy historically has been for sharing roles, and then with the advent of collections, it's now mostly for sharing collections. So this is AWX. Um, Let me see if I can get this UI out of my way. I can't switch tabs. No, I can't. Okay. So I don't know who all knows about the existence of this, but the analog to this is in Ansible 2.9. There's a bunch of modules in there that's tower underscore something. And that's also good to use with AWX. Um, but same as a lot of content that was baked into Ansible 2.9, it got moved out to collections. So all those tower underscore something modules came out into this collection, into awx.awx. There's also a collection called ansible.tower. It's the same content, it's just certified and served from the Ansible Automation Hub that's part of the Red Hat product. So if you see those two, if you're a Red Hat customer and you see awx.awx, or if you see ansible.tower, they are the same content, they do the same things. But over time, as this has been out, there had been multiple attempts to sort of standardize the use of this content. More than one group of people saw a need to put together a framework for using this, some roles to share. And in Red Hat, we have communities of practice, which is something that we in consulting frequently recommend to people is you should have a community of practice for automation where people in your organization, be they stakeholders or just interested parties or developers or everyone in between, gets together on a regular basis and just talks about what's up. Almost like this meeting, same kind of format. Maybe there's a topic, but mostly you just talk about what's going on. And in that meeting, a topic came up that, hey, there's all these different ways to use this AWX collection. Why don't we try to get all those parties together and come up with one? So secondary to this, we also have, I'm just going to close this because I need to change my browser tab. So in the namespace Red Hat underscore COP, there's this tower underscore configuration collection that's out there. And this is the result of that conversation and that work effort. So this is what we in consulting when we're asked to do sort of infrastructure as code approach to configuring AWX or Tower. In consulting, we don't work on AWX, we work on Tower exclusively, but you could use this for AWX. It would work exactly the same way. In fact, the demo I'm doing is going to be based on AWX, just to prove that you can do it, and because this is usually more of a community-focused meeting. So that's this collection. It's the demo I have is based on the 1.0.2 version because, as you can see, they just released an update 6 hours ago, and I haven't tested it, and I'm not going to do a demo based on untested code. So I think the main thing that's different in this brand new release here is that you can switch between Ansible.tower and awx.awx, like I was saying earlier. Previous to this 1.1.0 version, it just assumed that you wanted to use the AWX version of the collection, which is fine for what I'm doing here. And again, if you use the AWX collection and point it at Tower, that's going to work fine. All that's going to happen is it's going to pop up a little warning message and say, by the way, you're pointing at Tower. Did you mean to do that? But it'll still work. So that's this. They're both available in Galaxy, the AWS collection, as well as the Red Hat COP, Tower Configuration are both available from Galaxy. These are their source pages. So the AWX collection is developed alongside the code base for AWX itself. So if you're looking at the GitHub page for AWX and you click on AWX underscore collection, that's that. So this is all the collection code. It generally speaking gets tagged along with all the releases for AWX. So if you're working with AWX 15, which I'm going to be doing in my demo, I just choose to use the AWX collection version that got released with the software that it's meant to manage. So if I browse 15, this is the 15 version of the AWX collection. If I pull that, that's not what I wanted. If I pull up that page again, here's all the tags in the releases. So the releases should match the tags on GitHub. So that's what we're going to be using in the demo. What else? We can look at, so it's not so important to look at the GitHub page for the AWX collection, but for what we're doing here, the GitHub page for the tower config collection is, I think, rather important because you need to be able to look at the readmes. So there's this master readme, and really the meat of this is in the roles. So hopefully people are familiar with the concept of roles. And then inside of each of these roles, there's one for each type of object that you can have in AWX. So if I just click on one, there's a role readme in each one, and it'll tell you the data structure that it expects to find. So I can hop over to an example of this. I think all my introductory stuff is handled here. So this is just a normal AWX install. And make sure that we are logged in and responding before I do too much here. Okay. So there's not much to this. I have a few things dialed in already. I have a project called Ansible Examples, and that's pointing at this test playbooks repository, which is something I forked from the Ansible org. So this test playbooks is just a repo of test stuff you can do with Ansible, and there's this debug.yaml that I'm pulling out of it, and it's super simple. All it does is spits out a message. So the environment I'm intending to replicate here is a situation where you have a dev environment for Tower and a prod environment for Tower or AWX. That's really where this shines, is if you have a software development lifecycle situation going on, because you can define all of your configuration as code, send it against dev, test it, and then everything you did, however complicated it is, you can point it straight to prod, and you won't have to try to manually manage the small differences between your dev and your prod. So all of the classic advantages of doing anything infrastructure as code come along with this. So this is my quote unquote dev environment. I've got my project, I've got my inventory, I've got my template, and all this template does is if you run it, it runs against my two hosts in my inventory, and it spits out a message. We'll just make sure that that succeeds here. And it does. So I've got my lab host 1, my lab host 2. It says hello. That's the default value. And that's all I've got in my inventory here is 2 lab hosts. So dev environment pointing at a lab. The way that I've defined this in code then, we can take a look at that. So I've made a Git repo. And the way that I've started this out is you always want a requirements file. Where you put this is a question of whether you plan to run this in Tower or whether you plan to run it on the command line. I'm a fan of running it on the command line because it's sort of a chicken and the egg scenario, right? If you don't have tower configured yet, how are you going to use tower to configure tower? But also, not everyone is comfortable with command line Ansible. Maybe you have users that aren't super Linux savvy and you need that web UI component. So you can do this. This is fully compatible with the Ansible Tower credential type that comes with Tower. So you could do it that way, but I like to do it with the command line, and that's how I'm going to do it now. This format, if you're not super into collections yet, this format is what Tower is looking for. So you have to install collection requirements separate from role requirements, and it has to be in a collections directory and a requirements.yaml under that. The CLI does not require that strictly, but Tower does, so that's just a practice that I always follow. And then I've got two things in here. So I've got awx.awx I already talked about. I'm going to match my collection version to the version of AWX I'm running. And then I've got my Red Hat cop.tower configuration dialed in. If you do not specify this AWX part, that is a dependency of this second collection. So it will pull it down automatically if you forget. But another practice that I like to follow is explicitly versioning things that I know are requirements, just because you don't want to get into a situation, because requirements, if you don't have them and you haven't explicitly defined them, it's just going to pull whatever's the latest. And you don't want to get into a situation where you test it on some version, new version comes out, you go to a new environment and it pulls down some backwards incompatible change. And that's not good. So since I know that that's a requirement, I'm just going to version it even though it would come down anyway. So that's my requirements file. There is minimal task stuff here. So that's kind of the point of the collection, is to have all the roles and tasks written for you. So my playbook is, in the task section anyway, very simple. It just calls a role for each type of thing that I'm going to build in Tower. So I have got organizations, projects, inventories, hosts, that ties back to the inventory, and then job templates. So it's going to run 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 roles. And as far as tasks go, that's all the more complicated it gets. Up at the top here, I'm targeting a host definition called tower underscore this, tower underscore env, which I'm going to prompt for on the command line. You could, if you were doing this in Tower, you could do a survey instead, but since I'm doing command line, I'm doing a prompt. This is kosher to do, by the way. I think a lot of people don't think you can do that, but you can use Jinja templating in names and host directives if you want. So I'm doing that here. Otherwise, I'm just filling out some variables that are required by the collection. So it wants tower underscore hostname. I happen to be using an inventory structure, and we'll look at that next. The inventory structure I'm using has the actual Tower node itself as the host. So I'm just setting Ansible host, which is a magic variable populated by the inventory, to Tower hostname so that it works with the collection. And then I'm asking for the environment, dev or prod. I'm asking for a username and a password that I can use to log into the Tower API. One gotcha I ran into the last time I did this, if you are using LDAP, there is a security feature in Tower that by default does not permit LDAP users to create SAML tokens. And you need to be able to create SAML tokens in order for these AWX Tower modules to work. So watch out for that. I'm going to be using a local user. I'm just going to use the built-in admin user, but your options for that are turn off the security feature that disallows externally authenticated users from creating tokens, or just use a local user. That security feature, if you're wondering why it exists, theoretically, you could create a token as a LDAP user or some other externally authenticated user. Let's say that individual leaves your organization, their LDAP account gets disabled, but the token at that point is divorced from LDAP, doesn't care what happens to the originating account. So that person could, in theory, still have access via the token. So that's why that feature exists. So in this case, I'm just going to be using a local user. So I'm going to prompt for the user and password and the environment that I want to target. And that's about all there is to this playbook. The inventory, then I've got a tower underscore dev, a tower underscore prod as groups, and then I've got my actual host sitting underneath. I've got a big group called tower with child groups of dev and prod. This could scale infinitely. You know, if you had 5 environments, you just make them all children of this big tower group. And I'm just turning certs off because this is a lab. So that's my inventory. Not a whole lot to it. So the idea is that this is simple. So everything interesting then happens in your group vars. So things that are common to every environment, whether it's dev, QA, prod, whatever you got, it's going to be the same everywhere. I put those under the big tower group. And then anything that's going to be different per environment, I put those under the environment specific group. So I've already dialed in the code for what I just showed you in the UI. So here's my inventory. I should start with organizations. So that there's nothing to this, just a name. The inventory belongs to my organization. It has one variable in it. That's just so that I can fake having multiple hosts without actually needing to talk to them. And here's my job template. Here's its name. The org it belongs to, the project that it's going to use, the playbook that it's going to use, the inventory that it's going to use, all defined by name. And then things that are specific to my dev environment then is my project. And the reason it's specific to dev is because I want to specify a branch here. So your typical upstream first development model says you should use feature branches for development and merge them into master. So master should be sort of your default unstable branch. And then when you want to go to production, you would tag it and you'd point production at a tag. So what I'm doing here is I'm pointing my dev at master, and then when we go to prod, we'll point it at a tag instead. But that's a difference between dev and prod. So that's why it's here in dev instead of in prod. And then I have some hosts. So the name of the inventory is consistent everywhere, but I'm going to change what's in it depending on which environment I'm working in. And that's all it is. So if I run this, make sure I am where I need to be. And I am. So if I run this, I run it against my inventory and I do configure tower. It's going to ask me, do I want dev or prod? I'm going to say dev. You can't see me typing that because for some reason my WSL does not want to show me my command line inputs. Mystery, which we will not solve right now. And all I'm looking for here is to make sure that everything comes back green. So these tower modules are idempotent, which means that I should be able to just run this and everything should come back green, and we shouldn't actually make any changes because what I have here in code is indeed what I mean to have. And spoiler alert, I used this to configure it in the first place, so there should not hopefully be anything different. So, okay, everything came back green. We're good there. So the idea then is that I've got this prod environment. Not that one. That one. I've got this prod environment. I'm just going to refresh this because it's been a minute since I pulled that up. Log in as admin. Oh, come on. Okay, so there is nothing in here. Not even the demo stuff that typically comes with the official images. There's nothing here. There's no templates, no projects, no inventories, no nothing. Total blank slate AWX environment. And my plan then is to take the interesting stuff that I built up here and stick it over here with the changes that would be required to go to production with this. So I need to make that in my code. So I'm going to make a new directory in my group vars and I'm going to call it tower prod. And I'm already good here. I want to apply all this stuff and it's already where it needs to be, but I need to make copies of what I have in dev and I need to put it in prod. So I'm going to just copy my dev stuff and stick it in prod. So here's my projects. I said that I want to go to a tagged version of my repository for production. So let's go back and look at that. Here's my repo. Here's master. Earlier I made a tag that's v1.0.0. If you're not familiar with the concept of Git tagging, the idea is that you take a certain point in time, a certain commit, and you give it a name. You say, this commit represents a stable state of my repository, and I want to give it a name and point at it from production, and it will never change. You can make new branches, you can change master, you can merge, whatever you want to do. This tag will never change. So that's a nice stable state for production. So I've got this 1.0.0 tag that I want to use. So in production, I'm not going to go to master. I'm going to go to a v1.0.0. So that's my prod change there. And on the host side, I'm going to point at my prod host instead. So I'm going to change this to say prod host 1 and prod host 2. There we go. So that's really all that's different. And I already have prod dialed into the inventory part, so that part's good. We were just missing these 2 bits. So let's go ahead and run this guy again. This time I'm going to type prod. Again, you can't see it, but I type prod. And log in. So now it's going to try talking to prod. And you'll see the tasks are coming back gold colored, which means it's changing stuff. So it made my organization. It's going to make my project. The reason it's taking a little bit, by the way, is in projects here, I've got this wait yes. So that's going to tell it when you add the project, wait for it to sync first before moving on. And that's important because if you don't sync it first, actually I think that might have been what happened here. Oh, no, it's not. If you don't sync it first, it's going to try, and you go to try to use that project in a job template. It's not going to, it's going to try to use a playbook that doesn't exist if the sync hasn't happened yet. So that's a potential issue. So that's what this wait is for. This is just the lab being the lab. That's been happening to me the whole time I've been preparing this. I just need to run it again. The DNS is not exactly as reliable as it ought to be. That's all that's going on there. So these things already happened, so these should come back green, green. There we go. Intermittent lab fluke. So, okay, so this thing says it's done. Let's go find out if that's true. Playbook showed up. Project showed up. It's got the right tag. Organization showed up. Template showed up. You can run it. Cool. So now that you have your dev and prod in sync, the idea is that when you want to change something in dev, you can follow it into prod fairly easily. And that becomes more and more important the more complex your tower config becomes. For example, let's say you have a survey. Those can get kind of long and kind of difficult to reproduce across environments. So if I wanted to add a survey to my job template, I have it pre-developed over here, so I'm just going to paste it in, but we'll talk about what's in it. So I just added some stuff to my debug playbook here. Added a survey enabled yes. Here's my survey. This is a AWX API thing where it wants a name and a description for the survey, even though you can only have one. So I don't really understand why that's in there, but it's required. So I just put blank strings in there. That's what I do with it, and it works. So I'm going to ask for a debug message. So remember when we looked at the playbook code for this debug.yaml that I'm running, it just wants a variable called MSG, and it'll spit out whatever that message is. So I've got my type text, my variable is called message, default value of hello, and I want to put that in dev and see if that works. So I can run my playbook again. This time I'm going to type dev. Everything should come back green except for the job template. And the idea is that it will apply that survey to it. Oh, actually, I might have to actually save my file first. That might help. I always do that. Okay, so our change went in, and we can go back to dev and take a look at our job template. And we can tell from the UI that there's a survey here, otherwise this button would have said add survey. So here's edit survey, here's our debug message, here's our UI representation of what we just put in over the API. So that looks good. I want to test it, so I'm going to launch this. It's going to pop up. I'm going to say my dev message. So that looks good. That's what I wanted. So I consider this test to be successful. I want to put it in production. So I'm just going to run it again. And without any changes to the code whatsoever, I'm just going to point this at prod instead of dev. And I'm going to say, try not to typo my credentials. So if you can imagine, if you've got a multi-question survey going on here, that this is useful. I recently did one where it was like 10 questions, and there was an integer one, there was one that was asking for port numbers and IP addresses and lists of hosts and booleans and you name it, it was in a big complicated thing. So you can imagine how difficult it would be to take something like that by hand out of dev and into production. So here now over in prod, we should see the same exact change has been applied. It has. Launch it, just make sure that things are working the way we think they are. My prod message. There we go. So prod host one has got my prod message. Back here, lab host one has got my dev message. So without really any task code at all, the tasks are simply role includes. We've managed our tower infrastructure, done a whole software development lifecycle with it through just some variable files. So that's the point of that. This obviously gets more useful the more environments you have, the more complex tower config you have. It's not something that everyone would be interested in, but like I said, the more complicated your situation is, the more valuable this is. And that's all I got for the demo. Any questions, concerns with this? Going once, going twice.
It all makes sense.
Cool. Yeah, that's all I got.